I'm delighted to have with us today Dr. Camille Busette, who's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and directs the Race, Prosperity, and Inclusion Initiative there, and also Melissa Boteach of the National Women's Law Center, who is Vice President for Income Security and Childcare, and Katerina Sarayeva, Dallas Bureau Chief for Bloomberg News, who has been covering these issues in depth. We'll be giving priority today in questions to reporters on deadline. So please drop your question in the chat or just raise your Zoom hand and we'll give you the microphone. Thanks so much. And Dr. Busette, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Sonia, for that introduction and for that framing. And also thank you so much for inviting me. Congratulations to the award winners. And looking forward to seeing who's going to win in the next round. But I think that's fantastic. I'm really looking forward to the conversation today, and of course I welcome interruptions. So what I wanted to do first was just say that since this is a training program, I want to start by talking about how we frame issues on female employment and labor participation. And commonly we use an equity framework: equal pay for equal work, women in the boardroom or in upper management and the proportions thereof. And that framing, I think, works well to uncover long-standing pay and compensation challenges that women face in the workplace. From my perspective, the COVID-19 pandemic has underscored how important it is to think about and to write about women's challenges, both in the workplace and outside, as central to how our economy functions. That is what we have found out in COVID. And how we rise as a nation to global challenges like the pandemic, and how the US is increasingly dependent on women to fuel its economic growth, given the long-term downturn in male labor participation. In addition, I want to spend some time talking about which women we talk about and why it is important to recognize trends in diverse demographic groups, particularly because those groups are increasingly significant portions of our populations. And as a result, what I'm going to do is spend most of my time today on a discussion of low-wage earners, women who are low-wage earners, and particularly women of color who fall into that group. And the reason I'm doing that is that women of color are an increasing proportion of the US workforce. And so what happens to them is actually important to the economic future of the US. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to share my screen. I have a couple of slides, and I don't want to inundate anybody, but we're just going to review a couple of things. So I entitled this, are women destined to be worse off after COVID-19? And I think that's really the question we want to answer. So what I wanted to do is just sort of orient us in a way that Sonia did at the very beginning. So the big takeaway here is that COVID-19 has literally led to a very sharp drop in labor participation rates for women. The source for this, since this is a training program, is the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, BLS. And what I did is I pulled data from the high point of women's labor participation, which was February of 2020, and compared it to where we are now, the latest numbers, February of 2021. So if we're looking at the slide, on the left-hand side on the vertical axis is the percentage of labor force participation. The green bar are Black women, the green bars are Black women, the blue bars are white women, and the yellow bars are Latinas. So what we see in the February 2020, this is the high point for everybody, is that you're about 63%, 64% for Black women, labor participation, about 60% for white women, a little over 60% for Latinas. Now we look at February 2021 for the latest figures, and we see a huge drop for Black women, a slight drop for white women, and a pretty significant drop for Latinas. So that is going to tell you right there, if you're looking at that, who has suffered the most in terms of labor participation. So it's going to be Black women and Latinas in this particular case, less so for white women. And the reason we care about female labor force participation rate is that male labor force participation rate has been falling pretty significantly over the last few decades, and women's has been increasing. So when you see a decrease in women's labor force participation rate, just generally for the economy, that is a bad thing. But then for women themselves and what it means for their ability to close income and wealth and retirement savings gaps, it's actually pretty devastating. So that's why we're looking at this particular figure. So I'm going to move on to low-wage women, low-wage workers, women who are low-wage workers. And so the takeaway here is that if you are a low-wage earner, a woman who's a low-wage earner, you have experienced lower income during COVID-19 and, of course, higher stress. I'm not going to go through all of this, but there are a couple of things that I want you to take away. The first is that, as Sonny had mentioned, women are about 2/3 of the low-wage workforce. And that's really, really important to understand because this particular group of workers, low-wage workers, has been really hard hit by COVID-19. The second thing I want us to take away is that low-wage women in general, and particularly women of color, when they are trying to access opportunities in employment or education or training, have different kinds of social networks that provide information, access, and resources to get those kinds of, to access those opportunities. And those different social networks don't work for them as well as they do for higher income earners and also for white women. So there is an interesting interplay between being a low-wage worker, being a woman who's a low-wage worker, being a woman of color, and the kinds of social networks within which you are embedded that allow you to get a good job or to access a training program. And when you fall out of the labor force, or you are forced to take a step back, maybe you're part-time, those social networks are going to be affected. So that's something I want us to kind of take away from the entire kind of COVID situation. The last thing that I think out of this sense of set of bullet points here is that you have low-wage women falling into two categories, principally under COVID. One is women who are in low-wage leisure and hospitality sectors. So they were hit really, really hard, and they experienced the largest job losses. And they tended to be Black and or Latina. Then you had women who were in the essential worker categories. And the essential worker categories is about 34 million women there. Again, women of color are disproportionately represented in those kinds of frontline jobs. And they experienced, extreme stress because not only are they having to go out and work, but they were doing that under conditions that exposed them to COVID, and they were therefore then having to come back to their families, having potentially been exposed to COVID. But they, like women across the U.S., ended up shouldering a lot more of the child care and adult care responsibilities that arrived with the advent of COVID. So those are the key takeaways here. So generally, being a woman who is a low-wage worker and being a woman of color who's a low-wage worker and experiencing COVID puts you in a pretty dire set of circumstances. Either you lost income or you kept your income potentially, but your stress level and your exposure to COVID was much higher. And in a lot of cases, women who kept their jobs but had to take time off to care for relatives or anybody else, they ended up not being able to be paid for those days or hours that they took off. So there's just a net hit on income. So that's a big thing. And if you lost your job, it's obviously a hit not only on income, but also any particular potential retirement savings. So that's the takeaway from this particular set of bullet points. So now we want to think about, okay, so if these low-wage workers, women, were hit so deeply by COVID, what does that mean? What does that mean for them, and what does that mean for our economy? So this is where I think the framing is really important, because we know from a lot of work that demographers have done that women of color are a larger and larger proportion of our population. So if they are and if they tend to be concentrated in low-wage jobs, then whatever happens to them is pretty much sort of there's a through line between what happens to them and what happens in our economy. That's the first thing. The second thing is whatever happens to them also conditions what happens to their children and their families. So that's why we really want to care about that. That's why we want to think about, what are the kinds of policy interventions that we would try to propose and implement in order to address the challenges that are faced specifically by low-wage women of color and just low-wage women in the US workforce now as we are starting to get vaccinated. So the way I think about this is, what are the most likely post-COVID scenarios for women earning low wages? And I think the most likely, meaning policy stays relatively the same, meaning we are framing things more as an set of equality issues than anything else, is that we will have a slower return to work among those women than men because of the uneven opening of schools and daycare. That jobs may have changed and they may have been replaced by a robot or a man, so their skills might be obsolete. It's very likely that those who are in the long-term unemployed category, so that's more than 26 weeks, might find it hard to re-enter the job market in any case, regardless of whether there are jobs available. And then wages will continue to be low, particularly in jobs held predominantly by Black women and Latinas. So here, think about grocery stores, service sector jobs, people who work in nursing homes. Those are not jobs where employers are just saying, oh yeah, let's raise our wages. So this is, to me, what looks like the most likely scenario. And when you put it in the context of deep and devastating losses during COVID, what you will start to see most likely is that you have women who are not low-wage workers starting to make advances, not only in terms of their income, but potentially possibilities to get back into the workforce. And then you'll have women who are low-wage workers who are just following a totally different trajectory, which is that they continue to bump along at the bottom. What I think is less likely is that current jobs will pay a living wage. We've had a little bit of a discussion nationally about the $15 an hour wage. And I'm not sure $15 an hour is a living wage in a lot of places, but the idea that we would try to pay people a living wage is something that is hitting a lot of political currents. So that remains, I think, aspirational. I think entry into higher paying jobs with benefits, so this means that the jobs now will have paid leave and retirement, also seems unlikely. But I actually think that's more likely than jobs paying a living wage. And the reason I say that is that there are some incentives, I'm sure Melissa will talk about this, there's some incentives that were built into the most recent American Rescue Plan Act that try to incentivize paid leave, employers providing paid leave. And then I also think it's very unlikely that we will ever in this country in the near future get to ample and affordable childcare, but I would love to see a lot more robust discussion on that. And I think it is possible to do that when we start thinking about infrastructure. And that is something that's going to be discussed tonight by the president. So let's talk a little bit about the federal policy responses. So how do we get from where we are now for low-wage women to something that looks more aspirational? Okay, so I know Melissa's going to go over this, so I'm just really quickly going to review what's in the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. Basically, it's about stabilization. It's making sure that people don't fall further down from where they are, and it's really just about treading water. So you have as we know, the stimulus payments, you have the increase and expansion of the child tax credit for 1 year, you have funding for schools and daycare, you have credits to employers for paid sick and family leave, you have enhanced SNAP and Medicaid benefits, and there are a few other things. So that's currently where we are, that's stabilization. If we want to get to the point where these low-wage women are making up ground and then transcending where they were before, which was very low wages, no benefits, and stringing together childcare, stringing together a couple of different jobs to make ends meet. If we want to move from that, this is what we're going to need to do. We're going to need to make that child tax credit permanent. So not just for a year, we'll have to continue. Paid leave will have to be just routine in every single job. We'll have to find a way to get retirement accounts for those who are not offered them at work. So remember, if you're in a part-time job or you're in an hourly wage job, often you don't have access to retirement accounts, and that hits women particularly hard. That's why they end up having about 70,000 less saved than men by the time they retire. We obviously have to invest in retraining, and there are lots of ways to think about, for instance, the Trade Protection Act that allows some training for trade dislocation, but there are different kinds of ways of thinking about that, and we'll really need to focus on retraining low-wage women in particular. We'll also have to think about investment in caregiving infrastructure. So it's adult care, it's child care, it's care for people with disabilities. How do we invest in that infrastructure and allow women to be freed up to do other things? Obviously, we're going to have to think about a living wage legislation or incentives to provide a living wage. We'll need to invest in ample and subsidized childcare because childcare is expensive. Good childcare, where you're paying living wages to the people who are providing the childcare, is expensive. And then we'll have to intentionally focus on women's social networks, particularly low-wage women's social networks, as they are relevant to access to jobs and training as part of that recovery. So the way I'd like to explain that is typically when you have a policy, you impute or you assume that that information about a policy or an opportunity is going to funnel down through a set of transmission mechanisms. Those transmission mechanisms, meaning social networks, work differently for middle-class women and for upper-class women. They work differently for white women than they do for low-wage women or women of color. So we have to think about that when we're thinking about policies that will help improve the situation for low-wage women post-COVID. I am going to stop there and take questions or move on to Melissa, whichever one makes more sense.
Thank you so much for that, Camille. That was a terrific presentation. So let me turn it over to you, Melissa, to talk more about the childcare piece of it and to also talk about what we know about what's going to happen tonight and what might be included in what President Biden is going to suggest tonight on infrastructure. And I'd also like to say for those who are joining late that feel free to raise your hand, your Zoom hand, or put your question in the chat. If you want, we don't have to wait until the end for questions if you're somebody on deadline that needs an answer now, so you can buzz off and write. Okay, Melissa, over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks to Camille for an amazing presentation as well to build off of. So I wanted to start off by just quickly reflecting on the fact that it was 1 year ago in February of 2020 that we were celebrating women comprising over half the labor force. And you fast forward to 1 year into the pandemic, which is the latest numbers that we have, and you see that women's labor force participation rate has not been this low since 1988. And so what happened in between, I think, is an important story to tell, but it's also important for learning the lessons as we rebuild going forward about the importance of caregiving infrastructure, not just to women, but for the economy overall and for all the families that depend on women. So just a couple of quick by the numbers that build off of Camille's great presentation. The net number of women who have left the labor force since the start of the pandemic remains over 2.3 million. This is not evenly distributed. Black and brown women are disproportionately affected. So nearly 2.1 million women were pushed out in 2020, and the rest this year of the 2.3 million. And of those, 564,000 were Black women and 317,000 were Latinas. The unemployment rate is another important indicator of economic health. It doesn't tell the whole story, but it is important. And even though the jobs that were added last month in February actually disproportionately went to women, at the rate we're going, it's going to be a long way off before we sort of even get back to the inequitable pre-pandemic status quo. So the unemployment rate for women ages 20 and over was still last month almost twice as high as it was in February of 2020. So over the past year, the women's unemployment rate has doubled. And among women ages 20 and over who were unemployed last month, 2 in 5 were long-term unemployed, meaning they've been out of work for 6 months or longer. And this is important because we know from the research that long-term unemployment has greater scarring effects on long-term wages, ability to reconnect to the labor force, et cetera. If you go to the next slide. So again, this just sort of shows you graphically what I was saying previously, that you can see the dotted line across is the unemployment rate for white men, which is 5.3% in February 2021. And across the board, women have higher unemployment rates, but it's not evenly distributed. Black women, Latinas, younger women, and women with disabilities had nearly double the rates of unemployment as white men, whereas women overall were a little bit closer. We could go to the next slide. So what is driving this? There's no one silver bullet or one reason why it's happening. Part of it, as Camille discussed, is the concentration of job losses in sectors where women dominate: retail, hospitality, restaurants, et cetera. But a key factor in women getting pushed out of the labor market is the collapse of our care infrastructure. So just a couple of key stats here to help contextualize and paint a picture of just how dire the situation is. 1 in 6 childcare jobs has been lost since the start of the pandemic. That means that of the over 350,000 childcare jobs that were lost back in March and April at the beginning of the pandemic, half have not yet returned. And so we have lost key portions of our childcare slots and infrastructure. And we already had over half of Americans living in what's known as a childcare desert, which is a place where there's not adequate licensed supply of childcare. So there was a supply crisis prior to the pandemic, and now we've made it a lot worse. Other stats. In August of 2020, the Census Bureau found that about 1 in 5 working age adults said the reason they weren't working was because COVID-19 disrupted their childcare. And of those, women in sort of childbearing age were almost 3 times as likely as men not to be working due to childcare demands. This sort of echoes some research that we did back in September of 2020, which showed that 4 times as many women as men exited the labor force in September of 2020, which not coincidentally coincides with the return to distance learning and other caregiving responsibilities. And then finally, the collapsing care infrastructure can be seen from the employer perspective. So a December 2020 study by the Chamber of Commerce Foundation found that about 1/3 of employers said they'd already seen employees leave since the pandemic, with half citing childcare as the reason. Let's go to the next slide. So who are these workforce? Who is the childcare workforce? I think it's important because we're talking about women getting pushed out of the labor force as working parents, but it's also important to note that childcare is a largely female-dominated workforce. So 95% of childcare workers are women, and they are disproportionately women of color and immigrant women. So you can see by the purple bars here just how disproportionately women are overrepresented in the childcare sector. These are women who are paid poverty wages for doing the work that makes our economy run. When we say childcare is infrastructure, I think it's important to note that, yes, of course we mean facilities and the physical infrastructure, but it's also a larger metaphor for the way that childcare and care work overall bridges workers and jobs. And I think that something that has been made more visible for a lot of people over the past year is the degree to which childcare and caregiving more broadly is a public good, because when all of a sudden it disappeared and we didn't have access to it, people began to understand at a deeper and more visceral level the ways in which childcare is the work that makes all other work possible, that childcare workers are the workforce behind the workforce. Let's go to the next slide. So I think it's important to note that the cost of inaction is fairly high. We're going to hear a lot about the costs of the upcoming infrastructure package. And one of the things that I want to help to contextualize for reporters and others is what we're already paying. Right now, we have a system that is paid for by the low wages of women childcare workers, largely Black and brown women, and by unaffordable sums for parents who are foregoing other needs, getting pushed out of the labor force, foregoing other opportunities to advance. So there are plenty of costs. They're just being borne by the people who are most already disproportionately vulnerable. And I think that in a recession that has been dubbed the she session, because of the way in which women have been so disproportionately affected, you cannot really have an economic recovery without addressing the underlying reasons why we were so vulnerable. So there was a great study that I want to flag for you all that showed that it's the Century Foundation and Center for American Progress that showed the risk of mothers leaving the labor force or working reduced hours to assume caretaking responsibilities could amount to more than 64.5 billion per year in lost wages and economic activity. That's more than it would cost annually to provide affordable, high quality childcare for all. So just put that in context when you're thinking about the costs. There's also longer term scars. I want to flag for you all, we will have a paper coming out next month in April that shows if we did have affordable, high quality childcare, what would it mean for women's lifetime earnings? And what would it mean for women's retirement security, with breakouts by demographic, race, ethnicity, women's educational attainment, as well as state by state data. But what I can tell you without sort of giving away the findings that are coming out next month is that it's a lot. Women's lack of affordable, high quality childcare means they're more likely to not enter the workforce, more likely to drop out, or more likely to work fewer hours. And those lost earnings compound over time in lower wages into the future, and they compound over time into fewer contributions to Social Security and less ability to save for retirement. And when you add it all up, the lack of our caregiving infrastructure costs women a lot of money. Let's go to the next slide. So luckily, we are not sitting on our hands. There are solutions. I think something that's interesting about this year in particular is that it's the 50th anniversary of when President Nixon vetoed universal childcare. It was a bill on his desk. And this fall will represent the 50-year anniversary of that veto. And you think about what the world would have looked like differently, and the fact that we're now at another inflection point where we have a choice ahead of us about whether or not we're going to go in the direction to continue devaluing care work, both paid and unpaid, or whether we're going to invest in care as a public good, invest in care as infrastructure, and really unleash the full power of women in the economy and the families who depend on them. So we had a good start. The American Rescue Plan, which, as Camille noted, was mostly about stabilization. I think about it as surgery on a patient having a heart attack. Like, the system was in crisis and it needed to be stabilized. And so what the American Rescue Plan does is perform the emergency surgery. It pumps $39 billion in relief to the childcare sector. What's in that is nearly $15 billion for expanded childcare assistance through the traditional mechanism, the Child Care and Development Block Grant. That will help support both families and providers, help make sure that essential workers can access childcare, and states have 2 years to spend that money. There's also a $600 million increase in mandatory childcare dollars. That's it goes through the Ways and Means Committee as opposed to the Ed and Labor Committee, and they want a sort of ongoing $600 million increase in ways that will help sustain funding over time, which is important. And then the big centerpiece was a $24 billion new stabilization fund for eligible childcare providers. And that's going to help providers who are currently operating or closed for COVID-related reasons and help to rebuild some of that supply that was lost that I spoke about earlier. Center for Law and Social Policy has a great summary of some of the things that it will be used for. And states are right now in the process of beginning to write their plans and administer the money. And so personnel costs, rent and facilities, PPE, mental health support for children and early educators. There's a whole range of ways this $39 billion surgery money will be essential to helping to stabilize the sector. Let's go to the next slide. But again, we don't want to leave the patient on the operating table and say we're done. We actually, one of the things, again, that we've learned over the course of this past year, or at least has been more deeply ingrained in our public consciousness, is that the pre-COVID status quo was never okay. It was never okay that women were paid poverty level wages for caring for our children. It was never okay that parents were paying unaffordable sums for care children's brains don't magically turn on at age 5 when they enter a public school system. There is early care and early learning going on starting at birth. And it is a high skill, complex job to be caring and educating for infants and toddlers and preschoolers. And yet we were paying poverty wages to the workforce, and we were expecting parents to shoulder this educational burden largely alone. And so moving forward, we are looking for an equitable economic recovery plan modeled off the Child Care for Working Families Act. And the research shows that would create 2.3 million jobs, both through high quality jobs in the early care and education workforce, as well as through increased maternal and parental employment. We need to treat caregivers and early educators with the respect they deserve, make sure we have a pre-K system that's inclusive of all kinds of options, and then support safe, energy efficient, and developmentally appropriate childcare facilities, especially in childcare deserts and home-based options. That last piece is what we are expecting in the speech tonight. It was released earlier today in a fact sheet that the infrastructure plan of this administration will include money for childcare facilities, so the physical infrastructure of childcare, and we're very excited about that. I think it's important to note that when we say care as infrastructure, we are talking about it as more than facilities as well. It's about the investing in the workforce, investing in affordability, investing in the supply as part of that. And so we are looking forward to continuing to work with the administration and Congress to make sure that the ultimate infrastructure plan includes childcare as infrastructure more broadly defined as well. Next slide. I flagged a couple of resources for you all that I go to all the time and that I'm happy to follow up with you to send as well. But I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you so much. Melissa, that was just a terrific brief. Everyone, we will be posting all of the resources along with others, and probably all of that will be up tomorrow along with an interactive transcript and a video. So for those of you who want to go back. If there are any questions, we can break away now. And if not, I'm going to turn this over to Katerina, excuse me, Katerina, to talk about how you as a reporter want to cover this. I want to stop for just 1 minute and talk about sort of the meta of what's going on here today. I'd like to note that it's wonderful that we have all women speakers, but as far as I know, we only have female reporters on this call. If there are any male journalists that we've overlooked, we'd love to hear from you. But I want to talk about this question overall, and Katerina, maybe this could go to you first before your presentation. But how do we make non-females care about this, and how do we get this whole issue to not be stovepiped as a women's problem? You're covering the Fed. Is this still a niche issue? You've heard, Camille argue, no, this is, and Melissa both arguing, no, this is core to the U.S. recovery. It's core to who we are. It's core to the GDP. It's the infrastructure of everything. And yet here we are. Is it still a women's issue?
Sunny, we actually do have a question from Mark Grunberg, who identifies himself as a male journalist. So
okay, Mark, I insulted you, and you get the floor. Do you want to raise your hand first?
Yes, I did actually.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you for being here, and we're delighted. And you get the first question.
Well, yeah, I run a news service for labor union papers, so of course one of our big things that we cover is the unionization drives among child care workers, especially state by state. My question for Ms. Boteach is, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, is there's something missing here. If the child care workers get paid lousily, as they do, and yet the families are struggling with high costs of child care, as they are, as you said, where's the money going? If it's not going to into the ozone, where?
It's a good question. And it's something that a lot of people, especially parents, were like, why is this so expensive? And it's a question a lot of people struggle to understand. It's that the cost of childcare are almost all labor. And so there's obviously some other costs, but it's a very labor intensive industry that operates on razor thin margins. And so the money that I say we, because I have little ones, that we are paying goes directly to those salaries, and it's still not enough. And this is like, we would never say for public education, K through 12, like, well, wait a minute, well, I'm paying taxes. Why, because we don't conceive of it that way. But childcare is education, and yet we treat it as though it's a private responsibility and a private good, when actually it should be considered as a public good, so that the third party payer is the federal government. And that's where the money comes in, the same way it does for other public goods like roads and bridges, like schools, like defense. We all pay taxes to fund these collective items, and care has long again been considered this private responsibility for individuals to navigate, when in reality it needs to be reconceptualized.
Just as a follow-up, I would add elder care to the equation too.
Oh, sure.
Remembering how much people have to shell out when they care for their aging parents.
And actually, the Biden infrastructure plan announced tonight includes $400 billion in home and community-based supports, and other investments in long-term services and supports for elderly, people with disabilities, et cetera. And so that broader conception of infrastructure as applied to elder care is included in tonight's announcement.
Oh, thank you for that. Camille, was there something that you wanted to say?
No, I think we can go on to Katerina. Thank you.
Okay, Katerina, the floor is yours. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And that was a really interesting question. Definitely one. I had both at the beginning of covering this and when I was looking around for a daycare facility for my daughter. My husband and I were kind of like, where does all this money go? But yeah, it's really incredible, the cost of labor and the fact that what we pay is still providing pretty small wages. But yeah, some pretty small ratios of teacher to students that are required, obviously, for daycare, and especially for younger, small babies, because of course you can't have 10 babies and only one caregiver, because those of us with children know that would be a very tricky situation to navigate. But yeah, so I wanted to kind of start by talking a little bit about how we covered this in 2020 at Bloomberg, and then I'll talk about how we're looking to cover this in the next year. So we basically, started seeing the impacts of this early on the female labor force. In April, we realized that obviously this was going to impact a wide array of workers. We were thinking that probably it would impact women and people of color disproportionately, because as Melissa and Camille noted, they make up a disproportionate number of service workers and low wage earners. So we figured, because of that relationship, we would probably see this, the pandemic kind of impact those folks more. It was difficult in April, kind of in the heat of the lockdowns, because we didn't really have this data yet, right? It would come with the April jobs report, which we didn't get until early May. So we kind of did our best in that month. And there was very much still the thinking at that point of, this is a one-time shock. We're going to go into lockdown for a month, and then the lockdowns will be lifted and everyone will go back to work. Things will be great, right? This was the thinking in April. Here we are almost in April a year later, and things are not back to normal yet. So then I think it was really, toward mid to end May and definitely June that we started to realize this was a long-term issue. And that's when we really started to see how this was impacting women in particular. We started to see a lot of kind of writings coming out, like columns, and people on social media starting to vocalize kind of the crisis that they were feeling. Working mothers saying, you know, what's happening right now is not okay. The fact that I'm working my full-time job and taking care of my children full-time is not okay. I'm not okay. You know, something needs to be done. And it was also kind of, it was that sentiment of what's going on right now and the pandemic is not okay, but also, you know, reflecting back on the situation before the pandemic, that was not a perfect one by any means. So it was kind of like both of these forces were colliding, and it was clear that things were becoming, things were kind of coming to a head for women. So in the summer, we started doing more of the coverage of, you know, this is really impacting the female labor force. It could be here for a while. It could have long-term ramifications. In the summer, we also started to see the female labor force participation kind of plateau. You know, it had dipped a lot, as Camille showed us, at the beginning of the pandemic, and then sort of plateau, you know, came back a little bit and plateaued in the summer. Well, in September, it took a hit again, and that's because many schools across the country did not reopen, and a lot of child care centers for you know, children under 6 years old did not reopen. So you again saw women, a lot of women, leave the labor force to care for their children. So that's when it was kind of this renewed realization that this was going to be here for even longer than we thought. That's when we started to think about, okay, how can we cover this from a point of view of what's going to happen to women in the long term for their careers. We know that when women drop out of the labor force to care for young children, even outside of the pandemic, it has impacts on things like positions. You know, you miss out on promotions, of course, on long-term wages, on things like what Melissa talked about with retirement savings, right? It creates an earnings and ultimately a wealth gap. So we wanted to cover you know, that part of what was going on in the pandemic. So we did that through the fall. We then turned to look at the childcare industry, which is, you know, mostly staffed by women. As Melissa and Camille noted, women who do not make a lot of money and are a majority women of color. So we wanted to also make sure we were covering that and covering kind of what people were starting to realize about this industry, that it is more essential than previously, you know, than the society may have previously thought about. One of the things we found incredibly helpful was some of these surveys that organizations like the foundation,
National Education for Education of Young Children.
Yes, NIAC, but also I'm thinking of the survey from I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the name now, but I'll come back to it. And I think I sent it as a link. But anyway, yeah, NIAC as well, the Berkeley Center for like that studies childcare, the childcare industry. Several kind of institutions put out really good and timely surveys with like very timely data that was very helpful in putting, you know, real numbers to this issue. So we, in our coverage, really tried to bring in that. And then also, you know, talking to people who were going through this right now. You know, we really thought, we really wanted to focus on what was going on, and then kind of start to look ahead a little bit on what the ramifications would be for women. What was really helpful, and you know, I think you saw a lot of kind of these numbers in Melissa's presentation, is contextualizing it in terms of what it means for the U.S. economy, right? Because that, I think, can really help bring it out of just like a niche women's issue as it I think was thought of in the past, and shows readers kind of why this matters for everyone in the economy. So having those figures really saying like, this is the impact that the female labor force has on GDP. This is what it means for US competitiveness compared to other countries around the world. That really helped. And in that, we also kind of tried to compare what was going on in the US during the pandemic and even before to what other, especially developed countries were doing and had done in the past. So we know that the US has one of the lower female labor force participation rates when compared to other developed countries. And that is obviously not an accident. So we providing that kind of context, I think really brings this story, you know, to a wider audience. So let me see, I think one of the other things, you know, at Bloomberg, we obviously love to focus our coverage on business and kind of implications for businesses. So, you know, we were seeing in some of these surveys that it was becoming quite clear that businesses and kind of C-suite people were becoming much more aware of how much how big of a role, and this feels like almost a little silly to say, but how big of a role children and childcare play in workers' lives, and especially female workers. I think having Zoom meetings at home where your children may be in the background really kind of opened people's eyes to that. And I think that made employers realize just how important things like flexibility are, like in terms of flexible work arrangements and hours and such, and how perhaps things like on-site childcare, you know, how beneficial those types of programs might be. So before I kind of talk about covering this going forward, I thought it might be nice to kind of walk through how we use the Bureau of Labor Statistics data. I think I'll go ahead and do that now and share my screen. Let me see. Let me make sure this works. Okay, 1 second. Okay, so first I'm going to show, and this is working, right? Everyone can see it, okay. So probably one of the biggest data sets we've used throughout the past year is just labor market data from the Labor Department, and specifically from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So I was going to kind of walk folks through how we do that. This here is the latest jobs report. It's came out this month, and oh, I'm sorry, this is not the one. This is the one I want to show. Okay, so it came out on March 5th, and we will get another one this Friday for the month of March. So this is for February. And if you down, you know, through all of these kind of summaries, you'll see that there's a series of tables, a lot of different details, which are really useful. But I think one of the tables that has kind of most of the information that's relevant for us here is A1. This is going to break down a lot of labor market data by gender. So here we have men, and here we have women. And you can see kind of that, you know, I like to look at seasonally adjusted data for the most part. So let's look at this column, which is February 2020, and then we have February 2021. So you can see here for women 16 and over, you can see that they start with the full population, and this is, you know, people, yeah, just the terms they use, non-institutional, so obviously no one in prison. I think it also takes out farm workers, things like that. We then have the labor force, so this is anyone that is employed or unemployed and actively looking for a job. We look at the participation rate, which Melissa and Camille talked about. We have the number of people that are employed, the employment to population ratio, and then unemployed and the unemployment rate. And then the people not in the labor force. So this is someone who just is not working and does not want a job. And then so we can compare February of last year to the most recent data, February of this year. So that's great, right? I love looking at this table, but sometimes it's really helpful to kind of see how this has done over time. And for that, I like to go to, if you go to the main BLS site, they have a really great new thing that is this data finder. It's under data tools, data finder. And you can, this is a pretty user-friendly search where you can really find anything you're looking for in any of the BLS's different surveys. So if we're looking at, for example, the civilian labor force for women, we can type in civilian labor force women. So, okay, you can see here the search results that there's a lot of detail that they have. So we're kind of, I just kind of want the general figure. So I'm going to scroll down and I see it here. So I click on that and it's great because it gives you a little chart. You can, you know, toggle back, go kind of back in time and see how this compares historically. And then, you know, you can see some stats here, details. This is for 16 and over. You can see where it comes from. I think this is really a really helpful kind of data search. And then the other thing I wanted to point out is that you get here the series ID. This number can be really useful because it allows you to kind of pull this data in another section of the BLS website, which I'll show you in a second. So I'm going to share a different part of my screen now. Okay, so here I have an Excel sheet where I have a bunch of different kind of metrics for female labor force statistics. And I have pulled all of the relevant BLS IDs. That was the number I just showed on the on the BLS website. And a neat thing you can do is you can take all of these IDs, so for all of these kind of main indicators, and you can copy these, and then you can go back to the BLS website. So let me toggle back there. So let's go here. Let's go to bls.gov. You can go back to data tools and to series report, and you can put them all in here. You can just paste them all into here. And then you go to this kind of area that asks you how you want this data. So I'm going to choose a multi-series table so I get them all in one. And then I'm going to say I really want to go back all the way to 1948. You retrieve the data and you can download this to Excel, but you have basically for those 4 series all the historical data, and you can easily pull it into Excel and run any sort of calculation of, like, if you want to look at the percent change from a certain period, if you wanted to like maybe grab the same IDs but for men in the labor force, then you could do a comparison. We have been tracking the gap between several women over the pandemic, just kind of different things like that. But it's just a really useful, I think, tool that the BLS makes available.
Well, thank you so much. And our time is running out, so I just want to stop for a minute and ask if there's any more questions out there. You can raise your Zoom hand. While we're waiting for people to ask some questions, I want to go back to something that, oops, sorry, I just lost my screen when you lost yours. Okay, I wanted to go something back that was in the chat. A question earlier from Kathy, I may not be pronouncing this right, Gerchiek, who asked about the definition, the BLS definition of low-wage workers. And Camille answered this in the chat, but I'm sorry, Melissa answered it in the chat, but saying that the definition was the 40 lowest paid positions in the economy. So the very bottom, of which women comprise 2/3, and the link again is in the chat, and we will put that in the website. Just
to clarify, that's what we use, but the word like low wage is not it's not a technical term. It can be defined in different ways. I don't know if Camille uses a different configuration, but when we at NWLC use it, we typically look at the 40 lowest paid jobs.
Yeah, ours is the same. Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
40 lowest paid jobs.
Yeah.
Okay. Is it, Katerina, is that as far as you know, the news general standard for what is lowest paid or low income in those
Yeah,
categories, or
I'm
is there one in the news biz?
Yeah, I'm honestly not sure. I think like whatever data we're looking at, whatever like economist or researcher we're speaking to, we would use their definition. But it sounds like it's a bit like when we say middle class, you know, these things are not, there's not like a universal definition of it. But yeah, I'm actually, I was happy to learn that about the 40 lowest paying jobs. I did not know that.
Okay. And then going forward, as you look toward the president's remarks tonight and how you're going to cover this going forward, what tips would you have for journalists about, proactively, where are the good stories going to be in 2021? What should people be looking for?
Yeah, I think been really interesting to me is kind of this inflection point that we've clearly reached. I think we've a lot of working women and working parents overall are really feeling like we've reached a fever pitch with some of these problems, and there seems to be a lot of momentum for wanting things to change. So I think it'll be really interesting to see kind of what policymakers propose, if it's enough to address some of what people point to as real problems, like the childcare desert issue, and like I think keeping track of whether the money that's being proposed is enough for that is really important, and kind of if it has the political momentum to get through and get passed, I think that'll be really interesting. And then I think in the fall, especially as schools reopen more, I think it'll be really important to see how women are coming back to the labor force, and in many cases, if they are coming back. I think, speaking with working women is really important right now, kind of having checking in on what different people are seeing and across the wage spectrum, and then also, seeing what childcare providers are thinking about and going through right now, and in the fall when, hopefully things reopen more fully.
One thing I would say that I think is going to be very interesting, and you already hinted at this, Katerina, but it's going to be the debate around how we support childcare as a nation, right? I think there's a pretty clear story that the Biden administration is going to be able to leverage and move. But what's going to be interesting is how Republicans frame their arguments. It's going to be difficult to push against support for childcare, and I think it'll be very, very interesting to see how they frame it, what kinds of assumptions undergird that framing, what constituencies they're trying to pull in. So I think that's just going to be really, really interesting.
And I would plus one. Oh, sorry, Sunny, do I have time to respond? Okay. I would plus one what both Katerina and Camille said. One thing that I think will be interesting is the degree to which we try to see people gaslight women. That as we recover, this really wasn't so bad, et cetera, we're going back to normal, because as the economy reopens, there is a lot of frustration and simmering, just like memories of what this past year has been from mothers in particular, but for any caregiver, whether it's women or men. And I think that there is going to be a tendency when the economy is more robustly reopened to say, well, all right, well, you got to get a job. And the degree to which people are not recognizing that the time spent out of the labor force really are all the reasons Camille said, the social connections, the gaps in your resume, all the different things make it harder to get back in, and to get back in a way that is on co-equal footing to where you left. And so I would expect to see a lot of people trumpeting like, oh, well, now there's jobs to be had and I can't find workers for them, is going to be something that we are hearing. And to just guard against some of that narrative and thinking about, well, what are the wages being offered? And what is the caregiving infrastructure look like right now? Has it been rebuilt? Because if not, mothers are not going to be able to go out and look for those jobs. And so I think it's really, really important that we not just immediately forget all the lessons that we just talked about when the economy begins to reopen, and the narrative especially from people who want to hire, is, well, I can't find workers. And so I think it's going to be really important to be on guard against that in coverage.
And I think also to be on guard against and to speak with business owners or even women that are applying for jobs about kind of the other side of what I mentioned about employers being more aware of how much of our lives as working mothers are spent tending to children. I think the other side of that is perhaps conscious or unconscious biases against women with children, against hiring these women, because now, you know, they may be more aware of what time constraints may come with that or whatnot. I mean, we have been hearing this concern already from mothers. So I think this will be something interesting to kind of keep an eye on.
Yeah, caregiver discrimination is going to be something we're watching very closely over the next year.
Could I just go back for a minute to Richard Nixon and the veto of the bill and how the political debate has changed or not changed since then? So when he vetoed it, it was the government shouldn't be involved in this kind of a personal decision. Can you talk about what the prevailing ethos was at that time and the degree to which you think it has changed or not changed since that time?
Yeah, I mean, at the time there was a lot of pushback from Christian conservatives and others who thought, like, women, like, this is basically government socialized, taking over your caring for your children. And it's interesting. It was very much like, it's pushing women into the labor market. You fast forward 50 years. I mean, it's not that. I think there is a cultural conversation to have about the importance of work and all these other different kinds of things. But for most families, honestly, it's not a choice at this point. 2/3 of families rely on a mother's earnings. And over 40% of those families, there's new data from CAP that came out earlier this week about breadwinning mothers. Well, mothers are either the sole or primary breadwinner in over 40% of households, and 2/3 rely on a mother's income. For Black women in particular, it is much higher. And so it is not really a question of whether or not women should be working. It is a necessity for most families. And when we don't recognize that, it is the detriment not just of women and their advancement in the workforce, but to family economic security and our economy more broadly. And so I think it'll be important 50 years after that veto to reorient the conversation away from culture wars to what do families need to thrive.
Camille, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I would just say, I agree with that, but I think it's going to be a harder message now to deliver, now that so many women across the board have found themselves in a really, really tight jam. Everything from CEOs to, people who are home healthcare workers have had to manage care and a job. And so I just think that, Republicans may resort to that, no nanny state, et cetera, no pun intended, but I think it's just going to be a harder sell. So it'll be interesting to see how they pivot and how they try to rework that argument.
And also the science has advanced since then as well in terms of children's brain development and what we know about it, and what we know about stable and high quality settings, whether that's with parents or with caregivers. And the fact that children's brains don't turn a switch on at 5 and start learning at that point in a public school system, that they're learning from birth. And so the questions are both about women in the workforce and about the wages of childcare providers, and also about child development, and about the ways in which stable, high quality childcare settings are a huge benefit there.
Yeah, I suspect what's going to end up happening is we're going to be talking about how we pay for it. And that is where the real political kind of friction will be.
And I will note that we found $50 billion to bail out the airline industries very, very quickly before we found $50 billion to bail out childcare sector.
So let me go back to, I don't want to keep going back to the culture wars, but let me go back for just a second. One of the interesting things that's changed is we've seen a Zoom workplace in which men have children crawling all over their lap, and men are actually providing childcare in ways that perhaps were invisible before. Maybe they were doing it, but they weren't letting on that they were doing it because it wasn't cool. And now it's sort of, you know, that norm seems to have just been blown away by Zoom, because whether it's cool or not, it's just, you know, we're past that. The kiddies are there. They're, you know, they're taking their clothes off on screen. They're running around. They're doing what, you know, what they do. And so do you think that that's going to sort of level the playing field? Because the presumption was always, oh, women were doing that, but men really weren't. And so if you hire a man, you're not getting that, you know, extra tax at home. Or do you think that after the pandemic, we sort of roll back the clock and we go back to pretending that, you know, we're back in the 1950s in terms of the role responsibilities between men and women?
I don't think men have been stepping up in the same way on housework. I mean, it's not to say that no man has, or that there hasn't been some increased effort, but relative to what women have done in terms of hours, you can look at the time use survey about the time that women spend caregiving, the time that women spend on household duties, it's still much larger. And so I think that, and there's also just biases that even if you're in an egalitarian household where it's evenly split, and you know that's not my situation, there's still biases that emerge when people are thinking about hiring, promoting, et cetera, caregivers, and what they assume about what women do versus what men do that aren't going to be, I think, be erased by the pandemic. I hope I'm wrong. But I mean, you saw 4 times as many women as men dropped out of the labor force in September when online learning resumed. Like that is, yes, of course, there were the men that dropped out to help with their children's schooling, but 4 times as many women did. And so what does that tell us?
And I think the wage disparity also plays a role in that, right? If you have to pick one parent to stop working to care for children, it's probably in most cases going to be the one earning less. And that often is the mother still. So I think that, you know, that inequality also plays a role in that.
There's a motherhood penalty of 7 cents per child on the wage gap that happens for women, whereas men get a fatherhood bonus. They're seen as more responsible. They're seen as now they're breadwinners, et cetera. And so there's a lot to unpack. It's about like cultural biases in addition to sort of the ways in which laws and institutions shape the wage gap in the ways that Katerina mentioned.
Yeah, I think there are also lots of low-wage women who couldn't actually, you know, stop working, maybe because they were heads of households, or they just, you know, their family needed their income. And what I fear is that we're going to develop a narrative as we talk about, investing in childcare, that is a narrative that's very similar to kind of the welfare mom narrative, which is basically, well, you know, if these women would just get up and like, I finish school or get a better job, we wouldn't have to pay for the childcare for their kids, right? And I'm very fearful that something like that is going to develop. And I think we just need to be on guard for that.
Anytime someone says these women, be on guard.
Can I just go back to your 7 cent penalty, the motherhood penalty? Is that 7 cents per dollar per child? So if you have more than one child, if you have 2 children, it's 14 cents.
Yes.
And what is the fatherhood bonus? How many cents?
I have to revisit it, but I don't think it's as large as 7 cents, but it's still, the disparity grows. If you look at intra households, and the wage gap within a household before a child is born and in the 2 years after, that you can sort of see the spread growing in the father's income and the mother's income decreasing.
Okay, well, thank you all so very much for taking part in this really great discussion. Everything will be posted afterwards, and you guys are awesome. Thanks again.
Thanks for the opportunity. Great to see everybody.
Yeah.
Okay.